years now. We've been very fortunate to have done about 180 of these webinars. That means 180 weekends, Fridays we have used so productively for hosting these webinars. This webinar series actually commenced with a view to bring to the fore contemporary issues that are of concern to the policymakers in our country. As you know, EGROW Foundation is a research-based policy think tank in NCR. We have just completed about 5 years. And during this period, while we have been doing research on policy-oriented issues, we have also then thought that to bring in the best minds from across the world, Indians or foreigners, working on issues that are important for India or for the global economy, we have been very fortunate and having really benefited from this series. We have had a great blend of domestic scholars and international scholars coming and speaking to us. We have also had the privilege of listening to 2 Nobel laureates, and we have had the privilege of hosting under the G20 for Task Force 5, 10 webinars. Going ahead with the same story of supporting policy-oriented research and policy-oriented discussion in our country, keeping in mind that we are holding the presidency under G20, we wanted to do something on empowerment of women. And now, in that context, we are running a series of 10 webinars where we are inviting women, talking to us on women empowerment, and also talking to us from various angles how to empower women. At the end of the day, we have in our mind, in next 25 years, say by 2047, what would be the contribution, and can we increase the contribution of female labor force participation? That is the broad objective of having this series of webinars dedicated to women empowerment. It is in that very context today's webinar has been organized, and we have invited Madam Nikita Singla to come and speak to us. She is with the World Bank. I think she's also the Associate Director at New Delhi-based Bureau of Research on Industry and Economic Fundamentals. She has focused in recent years on regional cooperation, international trade and logistics, economic integration, ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, and women empowerment with a focus on South Asia. She has, as I mentioned, worked with the World Bank and continues to be there. She has worked in the World Bank's group Macro Trade and Investment Practice based in Washington, D.C., and continues to consult with other multilateral institutions also. She also associates with the Asian Development Bank on trade and logistics related issues. She is a part of the Advisory Council of Tailonomics India, a non-profit organization working towards creating a gender equitable South Asia. She is an engineer from IIT Delhi and studied international economic policy from Sciences Po Paris. With this, I invite you, Madam Nikita, to please share your research with us. You could take about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we'll open it to question answer session. Over to you.
Dr. Singh, and request Mr. E. Shankara Polaya to please mute yourself. We are having some background noise from your end. Thank you so much, Dr. Singh, and many thanks to the whole EGROW team. My deepest appreciation, for focusing so much on women empowerment as a dedicated section of your Friday webinar series. I think it's always great, and it's very fun to see when think tanks make a dedicated focus on this topic, because that's what we need the most. I just want to confirm, am I audible properly? I'm having some internet issues at my end. Okay. Yeah. So, and thank you for the kind introduction. I'm actually transitioning out of my full-time role with the think tank at Bureau of Research on Industry and Economic Fundamentals. And this month onwards, I'll be an independent consultant. So, and you know, for last 12 years, as Mr. Charan Singh mentioned, my focus has been on South Asia. So I'm actually looking at diversifying my trade and gender experience and working more in the US and in African countries, while I continue to focus on South Asia. So, you know, this topic is very close to my heart. I have been working on trade for last 12 years, but it's only recently that I started looking at the intersection of trade and gender. I was either doing women empowerment in silo or working on trade and trade facilitation related issues in another silo. But I thought, what about women in trade? And this is a question that came to me when I started visiting different border areas of South Asia, going to various ports for my trade related work. And whether there were 100 people in the meeting or 200 people in that brainstorming workshop, I would normally be the only woman. And I would not only be, you know, I would also not be the correct representation of women in trade, because I was always there and in my capacity as a researcher. So I really began to wonder, where are all these women? And it was very timely that last year, the US Embassy reached out to me and they wanted to commission a policy paper on the intersection of this trade and gender, really looking at women's participation in India's trade ecosystem. And that's the research I'll be presenting today. And we'll also share a link with you in the chat box after I finish, so that if you want to go deep, deeper into that paper, you can. You're most welcome to do that. So, first of all, if we really start looking at the changing geopolitics and geoeconomics, because if we look at trade and gender as a topic, it's not really about economics anymore. Even trade in itself is not really about economics anymore. I think more and more everything is becoming about geopolitics and geoeconomics. Those are the two new terms, hot terms that we use in the think tank jargon a lot. This growing attention around Indo-Pacific that again presents new opportunities to India for its great power ambitions and to expand its footprint across the region. And that's where we need to understand that India taking the lead in adding a gender inclusive perspective to cooperation could greatly improve outcomes on this topic. And at the same time, we all know there's so much attention around G20. So this could really help meet the global expectations of keeping gender equality at the center of the whole G20 agenda. So as I start, I mentioned, when I started doing this research, I found that everything was actually categorized into pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. Any numbers you look at, they would be pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. And so was gender parity. On the one hand, post-pandemic research showed that regardless of an economy's size and level of development, women have been disproportionately affected. And this was primarily because of overrepresentation in sectors that were hit the hardest, and some pre-existing gender disparity that we all understand, the whole societal construct, especially in the Indian context. But on the other hand, even before the pandemic, and the last global gender gap report that came before the pandemic was 2020 report, it showed that only 55% of the women globally were engaged in the labor market, as opposed to 78% of men. 55% of women engaged in the labor market as opposed to 78% men. And that report said that it will take another 132 years to attain full gender parity. And this is as per the more recent 2022 report. So where are we really heading? What is it that we need to look into as researchers, as think tank community, as academia? And if we start looking at this link between gender equality and trade, felt, and I was disappointed when I started looking at this link, that research on this topic has really been held back by limited data and a lack of understanding of the various roles women can play as workers, as consumers, as decision makers. And I think one of the earlier efforts in this direction was the 2020 joint World Bank and World Trade Organization report. It did make an initial attempt, and but though that report actually made some preliminary findings in terms of how firms that are actually involved more in trade also employ more women, and firms that employ more women also have more equal wages. So there were some preliminary findings. But I think the bigger question here is, why does empowering women really matters? And more so in the context of India achieving its growth and leadership goals. When we look at India's intent behind this subject, you see that India has been taking various initiatives with respect to changes in trade policy and capacity building, especially with respect to digital access, financial literacy, and trade upskilling. And one of my favorite examples here is Finance Ministry in India has come up with this National Trade Facilitation Action Plan, where action point number 27 is specifically aimed at promoting gender inclusiveness in trade. That's the kind of high-level commitment we are talking about from the side of the government. And also, during the pandemic period, India took several measures to facilitate trade and ensure seamless cargo clearance. And one of the flagship programs of customs was called Turant Customs Program. I mean, as we all understand, Turant means prompt. So the whole idea was, how do we make customs clearance more prompt? And the objective of this program was to make the entire customs clearance process faceless, contactless, and paperless. And I think it was very heartening to see that the biggest impact of an initiative like this could be felt on women community, because it really, an increasing shift from physical to digital has the potential to level the playing field, because we see that mostly, if we look at the trade value chain, women are primarily concentrated in the lower ends of the value chain. And as you move up, they would be there in the production, they would be there in manufacturing. But if you move up and you look at distribution, you look at marketing, you look at actually engaging with a cross-border trade partner, women are absent there. And I think that's also because they just find it much easier to hand it over to middlemen and engage them in this process. And I think initiatives like Turant Customs, as I mentioned, which makes the whole process faceless, contactless, and paperless, actually creates a level playing field for women, because women prefer lesser interactions on this front. While all these reforms are noteworthy, the data still shows that the female participation in total labor force stands at 20.3%, and against the male LFPR of 75%. So the female LFPR is 20% against male LFPR of 75%. So a lot more needs to be done to bridge this gap. But mind you, all these numbers that I'm quoting are about total labor force participation. If we start looking at the trade ecosystem in particular, these numbers are much lower, and we don't know what these numbers are, because there's absolutely no way for us to measure this data. And, and whatever I say on trade is actually based on more than a decade of research that I have done on this topic, and more recent visits to more than 25 ports in South Asia, which is a mix of seaports, land ports, dry ports, and air cargo complexes in the last couple of years. And during these port visits, I observed that while infrastructure and operations varied, there was one common thread. And that's not hard to guess. This thread was missing women. I just could not see any women at any of these border points. And the main challenges that this absence of gender disaggregated data at an individual firm level, which is why you cannot even assess how many women are actually present in the cross-border trading ecosystem. So in the absence of this gender disaggregated data, actually, I used my visits to these various border areas in South Asia to have some qualitative insights into the subject that formed the basis of my research on women's participation in India's cross-border trading ecosystem. And one of the primary observations that I made, which held true across the South Asian countries, was that women in general are concentrated at the lower levels of the trade value chains, with only a limited presence in production and manufacturing. And just as an example, I was working on India-Pakistan trade, and during my visit to Amritsar, I met several women who worked on hand cutting of dry dates. All of you must be understanding dry dates, the chwara that we import a lot from Pakistan, or used to import a lot from Pakistan. So there's this whole community of women around Amritsar which survives on hand cutting of these dry dates to make a living. And along the India-Bangladesh border, if you see, there are these informal markets called border hearts between the two countries. And, I remember having a discussion with one of the former housewives who was now a trader at these border hearts. And she was making almost $300 every Tuesday. And this is, I say Tuesday because that's the day of the opening of that particular border heart. It opens once a week. But this is the kind of empowerment trade can offer if we provide the highest level of encouragement and support, not just from the government, but also at a societal level. But that's the kind of empowerment we are talking about for these women. And while I was visiting these borders, there was also evidence of, it was not all pessimistic. There was also evidence of some noteworthy initiatives taken at a local level that reflected at least a local level commitment to make the ecosystem more conducive to women's participation. And an example here is the Agartala land port along the India-Bangladesh border. And when I visited there about 6 months back, I saw that they had installed a sanitary napkin vending machine, which was a very surprising initiative for me because I had not seen that at any of these other 25 ports I visited. So I felt that's a positive sign that cross-border trade is becoming more and more attuned to the needs of the women. And similarly, there's another port called Doki port that's recently inaugurated. It was inaugurated in first week of May. It's also along the India-Bangladesh border. It's in Meghalaya on the Indian side. Women actually comprise 40% of the workforce, 40% of the workforce. Again, something that we haven't seen at any of the other ports before this. And when I asked the local port community there, they actually told me that there were these very specific initiatives that were taken to recruit women from the local community. It is through all these first-hand observations that I got deeply interested and concerned about the subject at the same time. And the invitation from the US Embassy to write this, paper, which I'm going to share after I finish talking on women's inclusion in India's trade ecosystem, was a great opportunity to really dig deeper into this fundamental issue. And, if we see, basically, as a part of this research, I made several. I'm also conscious of the time. So, but as a part of the research, I made some very specific recommendations in terms of policy reforms or actionable steps that need to be taken in order to promote women's inclusion in India's trade ecosystem. And we need to understand that when we talk about trade policy by its very nature depends on international and multilateral trade architectures. And besides the WTO, the emergence of other regional and multilateral trade policy arrangements, they offer broadened horizons. And a lot of countries in the Indo-Pacific are already making progress towards facilitating a more equitable and rules-based order. And those you in the audience who follow Indo-Pacific closely must be knowing that the four pillars of the IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, are trade, supply chains, clean economy, and fair economy. And if we look at these four pillars, trade, supply chains, clean economy, and fair economy, we understand that if the whole objective is basically to advance resilience, to advance sustainability, inclusiveness, economic growth with fairness and competitiveness. And centrality of women's empowerment to all of these cannot be overstated. There's plenty of research on this topic, which actually says that how women's participation in trade makes it fairer, makes it more resilient, and makes it better able to support supply chain resilience. And all these digital trade tools actually help promote the participation of women in these supply chains. So it's actually a win-win for supply chains as well as women's participation. And also there's a lot of focus on clean energy, and these days it's also a pillar of the IPEF. And there's again research to show that how women's full participation in renewables is essential to ensure a fair and green future, and greater proportion of women leads to a decline in corruption levels. I think this more equitable and rules-based order that we are talking about, the participation of women is a core to this. And to improve women's participation in trade, as I mentioned before, these various reforms are needed as laid out in my policy brief that we'll share. But to implement any kind of reform that I will be listing, a cross-cutting recommendation is collection of trade statistics broken down by gender. Because as I mentioned before, the main hindrance to doing research on this topic is actually lack of gender disaggregated data. So for more informed policy making and impact assessment, it's really recommended to collect national gender disaggregated data at the firm level. And more importantly, make it readily accessible to third-party research organizations, to people like us, to individuals like us in the academia, so that we can actually, analyze that data and make some substantial recommendations to the government. More granular data collection will really allow policymakers to better assess the degree to which women participate in international trade, as well as barriers to gender equity. And when I did this topic, a lot of people asked me that should these reforms be gender neutral or gender blind? And my response to them was gender analysis is opposite of being gender neutral or gender blind. I think, we don't need to keep talking about being gender neutral or gender blind. We really need to acknowledge the differences. And then keeping in mind those differences, we need to analyze the gendered participation and the gendered differences. And also, I think it's a good news how the concept of gender budgeting is gaining legitimacy in India. And in financial year, the last one, 2022-23, there were 41 ministries and departments in India that reported an amount of $20 billion in the gender budget statement, which was an increase of 11% over the previous year. So I think it's necessary to take this exercise even further to ensure gender-sensitive formulation of legislations, of policies, of plans. But again, none of this can happen in the absence of just gender disaggregated data. Well, they say only what gets measured gets done. So we need to start measuring it. And once we have this greater availability and access to trade statistics broken down by gender, we can focus on many other reforms. And I'm going to club these reforms into 4 primary categories. The first category is skilling, training, and mentoring of women. And this is primarily for transition to higher levels of trade value chains. And I can probably share my screen, which will just make it easier for all of you to follow. I hope I have the option to share the screen. Yes, I do. Mr. Singh, is my screen visible?
It's visible now.
Okay. Yeah. So, As I said, collection of trade statistics broken down by gender is the core of this. But other than that, there are four main areas of reform that I want to talk about, which is skilling, training, and mentoring of women. The second is how do you reform trade institutions? So the first is how do you reform women, so to say. The second is how do you reform trade institutions? The third is at a trade policy level, what are the kind of reforms you need at a high level? And the fourth is advancing overall women's holistic empowerment. And I want to quickly take you through these because this is the crux of my research that I conducted. So when we talk about skilling, training, and mentoring women, we are talking about supporting women's transition to higher levels of trade value chains. And I have in my research, I've actually shown this with the example of the agriculture and spices sector in the Northeast, that how more capacity building in marketing and distribution can actually help women transition to these higher levels of trade value chains. And this is validated by World Bank research on the same topic that's quoted in the paper. The next is training and educating women on financial inclusion, because even if we still see if we see access to loans and access to credit by women entrepreneurs versus male entrepreneurs, it's still like women entrepreneurs are not even using 50% access to credit compared to male entrepreneurs. So I think we need to train and educate these women on what are all these financial inclusion instruments that are available to them. So mentorship, third is mentorship, which plays a huge role. And I say this more from my personal experience because I think I was fortunate enough to have key mentors and key cross-border mentors very early on in my career, and I owe a lot to these mentors. So I think when you actually have cross-border mentorship programs with mentors in male-dominated sectors, because some of the particular manufacturing sectors are actually seen to be very male-dominated. Let's say you have to talk about iron and steel sector. You think of it as a male-dominated sector. If you talk about textiles, you think of it as a female-dominated sector. We have all these mental biases with respect to certain sectors. And there is World Bank research again to show that how women that actually cross over into male dominated sectors are make for much more profitable businesses. The fourth is facilitating the formation of all women trade associations, and particularly to leverage e-commerce opportunities. And an example here is SEVA, which is Self-Employed Women's Association, which is doing great work now, not just outside the region, but, if we see across the region, involving women from Afghanistan, from Bhutan, from Bangladesh. And while I was doing this research, I had the opportunity to interview a lot of these women, especially from Afghanistan, who have been so empowered because of their participation in these trade associations and how they are actually being able to leverage these e-commerce opportunities. Then we need awareness and capacity building workshops for more women to participate in cross-border trade. And I used the example of India-Bangladesh border hearts before. And, again, a lot of women don't even know that these initiatives exist. So we need more capacity building for that. And lastly, we need basically induction of capable women in trade-related and leadership positions. And for this, maybe we need to partner with individual organizations. And as I said, I sit on the board of Talentnomics India, which is primarily focusing on promoting women in public and private sectors, in South Asia in leadership positions. So we need to do more of this, but with a focus on renewable sector, because that's one of the key pillars of IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. So these are some of the examples of the kinds of initiatives we can take to skill, train, and mentor women. But if we talk about trade institutions, we need to start overcoming the gender financing gaps by making financial institutions more gender sensitive. And as I was doing this research, I found out that if you look at all the financial institutions in India, 17% of staff of these financial institutions is women, only 17%, 1-7. Which makes it clear that for a person sitting inside a financial institution, it is very difficult for you to understand the kind of biases and the kind of challenges women entrepreneurs face when they come for access to credit or access to finance. So I think first of all, we need to make our financial institutions more gender balanced, really to be able to provide equal access to credit to our women and male traders. And then enhancing participation of women in regular trade interaction forums. There's something very popular in India called PTFC, CCFC. These are permanent trade facilitation committee and customs clearance facilitation committees. These are committees that are formed at the local level at each of the ports in India. And I've had the fortune of attending a lot of PTFC, CCFC meetings, which are generally open only to traders and government customs officials. But again, one common observation is women are missing. So even if women are present at the port, they are not actively, represented in PTFC, CCFC. Then the pursuing high-level trade policy reforms is actually, incorporating gender-specific provisions in India's trade policies. There was a lot of noise that the new foreign trade policy that recently came out would talk about gender, but unfortunately, it did not mention about gender. So that's the kind of sensitization we need within the government, and also all the ongoing negotiations for different bilateral FTAs. We need to focus on having, a focus on gender. And I met the Australians just last week as the India-Australia agreement is in talks. They're actually focusing very heavily on having a gender chapter in there. And then there are some specific examples I've cited, which actually shows that how there are gender-related tariff differentials. And by this, I basically mean that sectors which are male-dominated and female-dominated, how actually you see a difference in tariffs in those sectors. And lastly, it's women's holistic empowerment. We know that women can only be actively represented at work if there is enough care infrastructure at home. So we need to adopt policies facilitating women in the workplace. And one primary thing to do is to increase public investment in care economy. We do not even have 1% of our GDP that goes into care economy. And also to convert maternity leave into parental leave, because we day in and day out, I mean, India was celebrated so much when we increased our maternity leave to 6 months. But I think if we look at a more granular level, that actually most of the times works against women. So it should not be a maternity leave. It should actually be a parental leave where you decide for the parents, you leave for the parents to decide who wants to take how much of the bonding leave. It could actually be called a bonding leave as it's there in some of the other countries. And lastly, when you talk about holistic empowerment, you need to diversify the gender budget allocations to different government departments. And one of my favorite examples again is you actually made gender tagging of all projects mandatory. And this is an approach that was started by the World Bank, that irrespective of whether there's a gender element in that project or not, you need to have mandatory gender tagging of that project, which basically means if I am, funding the construction of a road in the Northeast, 100-kilometer stretch of road, and you see these many community, this much of community would be displaced, you actually see that how many women would be displaced within that. So you have a gender tag to each of the projects to see what are the women beneficiaries, what are the women stakeholders, what's the kind of impact we are talking about on women. And since I'm sharing screen, I want to quickly use this opportunity, to show some pictures. These are from the recent port visits. This is the Doki border that I was mentioning at India-Bangladesh border. And this is the border where they said they have 40%, only port to have 40% women in the workforce. And this is primarily because the Land Ports Authority of India took proactive measures to recruit women from these local communities. This is the woman housewife I was talking about, who was not working before India-Bangladesh border hard started, and now she's greatly empowered by her participation in this trade and is making up to $200 per week. This is a picture from Jammu and Kashmir from the cross line of control trade. And as you see, I'm doing a workshop with all the traders involved in India-Pakistan trade. And we are two female researchers. And other than that, it's heavily male community. So I think, I mean, these are the kind of images that actually show you that thread of missing women across the sport community. So I think I'll stop here. I managed to stick to the 30 minutes timeline, I hope, and I will be very happy to take more questions from you and the audience. And if there's anything specific you want me to focus more on, I'll be happy to do that. Let me stop here. Thank you so much for a very patient hearing.
Thank you very much, Nikita. This is really fabulous. And I'll be very honest with you, having studied some part of sociology and worked in different places, I was never this sensitive to issues that you have just raised. I'll also be very honest. I have lived in various parts of the country, quite a few of them on the borders. And so I've been to the Bangladesh border, and I've been to the Indo-Nepal border. And I've seen the hearts which you were referring to. And you are right. Very few women on those hearts. And never realized that how do you have women here when there is lack of facilities for women? And this I've gone at different points of time, both working at the RBI and then later. And I would notice that, and I would then always wonder, because these are different countries and these are border markets, so there could be some risk, and that's why there total absence of women. But what you have mentioned today is something so important. I would thank you for also sharing some data with us. And as a person who's from the financial world, you're right. The gender sensitivity to the banking institutions has also to be there, both in the workplace, also in providing facilities in the vicinity of the financial institutions, as well as deposits and lending facilities. So I think lots of policy implications of what you have mentioned. And I think your working paper will be really useful once we have a copy of it. Now, I was only wondering how, and if you want to elaborate it further, I like the idea that you had. You have spoken about the bonding leave. So where you bond, and therefore both the parents should have probably an opportunity to bond, and also the society should probably, and the workplace and the corporate sector should provide and accommodate both the partners to have this bonding thing. Otherwise, I think it becomes a challenge. I do not know if you want to speak on it or if you have done research on it. How about you do mention about the care economy, and there I'm sure you have in mind the child care centers and crèches. I have a feeling in our country, we have shortage of crèches as well as shortage of adequate crèches in which the working women will feel confident in leaving their child and working in the office in a fearless state of mind or in a carefree state of mind. Would you have something to share on that? The second thing I have in mind is most of us do talk about female labor force participation, and there you know that we talk about most of our talk is focused on women in the workforce and ensuring that they're in the workforce, their workspace. But have we thought or discussed about little elderly women and how to engage them and how to ensure that they don't retire that fast, because men continue to be in the workforce far longer than women. So anything that you would have on these two issues?
Sure. Thank you for your question. I've also posted the link to the policy paper in the chat box. So if anybody wants to download, they are most welcome to do that.
We will also, along with your talk, when we put it on our website tomorrow, the recording, we will attach the policy paper. We'll do that. And we'll also tweet it along with your talk, so it reaches the concerned place.
Hello, ma'am.
So, Mr. Singh, to answer to your question, I did look at some of this data when I was doing research for something else. And you see, overall, it's actually a positive setup where more and more girls are going to school, more girls are graduating from college. And the latest data that that I had researched on, and this was a couple of years back, I think maybe 2021, that in India, women made 42% of new graduates, but at the entry-level professionals, they are 24%. And of these, 7.7%, make it to the board seats level, and just 2.7% of the board chairs are held by women. So what really happens to these educated women en route, on the way, that's a completely different story to look at. And it's, of course, societal norms, it's family hurdles, it's lack of equal opportunities, access to finance, knowledge, technology, and women's own confidence levels. I know someone in the chat posted that it's also women's risk-taking ability. I agree. But, that's also because our whole ecosystem is not conducive enough for women to take that risk, to really incentivize them to take that risk. Then there are organizational inflexibilities, workplace attitudes, lack of supporting infrastructure. I was in Washington, D.C. working with the World Bank, which has, one of the best care infrastructure. But the it almost seems like a joke, but the waiting queues for the World Bank Child Care Center were so long that you had to be on that queue before you even start planning for a child. So we are looking at a queue of about 2 years or about 3 years. So I'm saying before you even start planning, that's when the parents need to be on that queue, which basically says that even organizations and institutions that do have childcare infrastructure, we don't have enough of it to cater to the demands of the population. And in most of the cases, we don't have it. It's actually complete absence of this infrastructure. And there was another question where you asked about the differences in the men and women when you talk about this, care infrastructure, care work. And, there's this data by OECD, which shows that in India, men devote 36 minutes a day to unpaid care responsibilities. I want to repeat, in India, men devote 36 minutes a day to unpaid care responsibilities, out of which 36% goes into housework, with the remaining time spent on shopping, care for household members, and travel related to household activities. And this is from an OECD report. And out of the 6 hours that women devote to unpaid care activities, the average for women is 6 hours per day, average for men is 36 minutes per day. And out of the 6 hours that women devote to unpaid care activities, time specifically spent on housework is 85%. So, when we start advocating for equal opportunities at workplaces, at trade, in trade ecosystem, we need to understand that first we need to make this ecosystem at home more conducive for women to be able to participate in all these things outside home. And for this, again, we talk about the childcare infrastructure. And then I said maternity leave, it's again, when you make it 6 months, that actually sometimes impacts the women negatively in terms of their career, because if you are actually newly married, and I have examples of these, I have anecdotal evidence of these, that how some of the organizations actually discourage or are not open to hiring women who are newly married, because they see them as a cost that they will have to give them 6 months of maternity leave. But if you convert this maternity leave into parental leave, then organizations would not see this as a cost or just for women, it would be for men and women equally because this leave would be shared between the two. Did I miss any of the questions that you said?
I think, Nikita, there are lots of questions in the chat box, and I was wondering if you would like to dwell upon them, but I still am not sure if when we talk of female labor force participation, I've got my answer there, because I understand you mentioned it very well that how many of these of the females graduate, 44%. How many of them join at the workforce? 24%. What happens in between? Where do they go missing? You spoke about the married couples. But I was wondering, after the motherhood period is over, women coming back to the workforce and continuing with their journey, though with a little setback, are there studies which show how quickly can they be absorbed back into the workforce? Or put it like this, a young woman goes missing from the workforce at the age of 23 when she has got married, but by the time her children are back in the college and she is 45, can she, or is there evidence to show she joins the workforce and then at that cohort, there is little narrowing of the gap between male participation in the workforce and female, or even if it is, say, 55 or 60, and in that cohort, there is a narrowing down, or no such study has been done, and that doesn't matter.
So, Mr. Singh, I'll have to look at specific studies in this regard, but I know, when I was doing my research for another topic, we actually interviewed women who did not come back after their maternity leave and asked them what was what was the main reason that they felt they considered a hurdle for them to not be able to get back into the workplace. And one of the main I would say there were a couple of things. One was the biggest factor was absence of childcare infrastructure, because if you do not have that, there's no way for women. I think in India, women still have the luxury, I would say, of being in a joint family ecosystem in some cases where you still, you have some kind of childcare at home. But in a lot of cases, you do not have that option. And the second is organizational inflexibilities. And this is something that has changed post-COVID, but remote working was not a concept that was acceptable before COVID. And I would say even now after COVID, after things are getting back to normal, a lot of Indian companies, particularly based on my research, are actually forcing, or I would say going back completely physical modes of working. They are not functioning on a hybrid mode. And I know several examples here. So I think these are organizational inflexibilities, I would say. In today's day and age, we need to offer this flexibility, for our staff members, for our employees, that basically you need to focus on what enhances the productivity rather than focus on face time per day, that you need to have these many hours of face time in office space, in office premises. And if we look at the senior most women, women relatively at the senior ends, I think that's where I have done more work with the senior management, women in senior management, but who haven't gone to the leadership positions. But I would say they are at a senior manager level, but then couldn't make it to a VP level or couldn't make it to a director level. That's the topic where I have looked at, for several years now as a part of my role with Talentnomics India. And one of the biggest constraints women face is that they basically cannot see that what is next for them, after that position, because to get promoted to leadership positions, there's this whole gamut of issues that comes at play. So either women have to make a conscious choice of staying where they are despite being overqualified for that position. Some of the women just get frustrated and decide to step out of the workforce. So I think this is where, and we run a program called Crucible with Talentnomics India. It's a play on the word crucible, which is a 12-month leadership induction program, which actually focuses on different skill sets, which includes negotiation, which includes communication, which includes self-sponsorship. So what are these different traits that these senior women need to get promoted to the leadership levels? Because when we talk about leadership levels, the world is still largely a boys' club, and I deliberately use this term, because it is indeed like that. So I think to break that glass ceiling, we need that. And then since we do not have women in the leadership levels, that also impacts, that has a trickle down impact on women in middle management levels, because you don't see any role models. If I am at a mid management level in my organization, I see that there has never been a woman VP or a woman CEO or a woman director. You stop aspiring for those positions. So I think at mid-management levels, there's also this issue of lack of role models and lack of mentors for you to be able to step up to those positions.
Thank you. Thank you. So there are a couple of questions here. One of it is, I thought some of the questions are very interesting. I thought, look at this question. What is your stand on mandating gender impact analysis in various projects? And then even this question in Tamil Nadu, I thought that's an interesting one. Government free bus scheme for women has made significant changes in the life of women. Many marginalized women families now using this bus service and save their monthly expenditure. This will help them to further investment in their business and try lift their life. And even the one from Simran Bida, debating a little bit from the topic, but when we talk about Indo-Bangladesh border, and further on she goes to say, what are the measures do you think the governments from both sides should take for these people, considering women are getting marginalized further in this vulnerable area? I know that female labor force participation in Bangladesh is double that of. So obviously they are doing enough, but what can India do? Do you have some thoughts on this?
Hello, sir. I also had some questions.
Sure, we will come to you after the ones which are in the chat box.
Okay,
Then
okay.
we'll give an opportunity to please
Thank you,
raise
sir.
your hand and
Okay,
I will
okay.
come back.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much.
So I'm happy to quickly address some of the points that have been raised in the chat. Indeed, very interesting. So Gayatri Sahu, you have made the point on, on mandating gender impact analysis. And as I mentioned, when I was speaking, there's this World Bank approach of mandatory gender tagging of all projects. It's primarily same as, making gender impact analysis mandatory. And I mentioned the example of a road construction in Northeast. And if you look at community displacement, you also need to start looking at what's the share of women. So any kind of project that you undertake, you see what are the kind of women beneficiaries, what are women stakeholders, what's the overall impact on women. So I'm 100% for making the gender impact analysis mandatory and making gender tagging mandatory. And as I said, I think World Bank has an excellent approach, and it was one of the first multilateral institutions to introduce this. The second question is on from Dr. Ramesh Kumar. It's more of a comment, and I know this is interesting because a lot of different state governments are doing this. We saw this happening in Delhi. We saw this happening in Punjab more recently with the coming of the new Aam Aadmi Party government, and then you mentioned this is happening in Tamil Nadu as well. Personally, I'm not a big advocate of giving freebies in different forms, but I think some kind of an initial push is always good to create a kind of a level playing field. We don't need this forever, but to do it for a specific period of time can actually help women. It's basically a nudge as we talk in economics, that you actually push the women to use more of public transport to get from one place to another, to make that little extra saving which can be used elsewhere. But we don't need to do this, because I know, a lot of people are against this. So I wouldn't say I'm against this, but I would also say I'm not for this to do it at, for an indefinite period of time. I think it's a nudge that has to be used appropriately. The question from Simran Beda on what kind of initiatives government should be taking, especially for women from these vulnerable areas. And Simran, I think it's an interesting topic, and so UN Women has recently come out with a report just last month, and you should look at it. It's called Impact of Climate Change on Women. And it actually says that how, we are all talking about climate change, about vulnerabilities with respect to climate, but we tend to overlook that how climate change has a greater impact on women. And those are the kinds of nuances we need to be very conscious about, be very sensitive to when we formulate policies at the local level. And so I think more and more research looking at gendered impact of these various kinds of issues that we are talking about will be useful. So I'll not go into details. It's not really my area of looking at marginalized communities from vulnerable areas, but do look at this research done by UN Women on impact of climate change on women.
Let's open to the audience now, and please raise your hand whomsoever wants to ask a question. And Yash, why don't you come first, and then we will go to Dr. Kurian. And Nikita, we could answer one after the other. Let's take a question from Yash. You can respond, then we'll take a question from Dr. Kurian. Yash, please go ahead.
Hello, sir. Hello, ma'am. Good evening. तो मैम जो स्टडीज आपने ये सारे पोर्ट्स पे किए, सो व्हाट सॉर्ट ऑफ प्रोफेशंस वेयर देयर ऑन दीस पोर्ट्स एंड वेयर डू यू थिंक वुमेन शुड पार्टिसिपेट इन दिस, जो ये पोर्ट का पूरा इकोसिस्टम है प्रोफेशन का. And the second question being that gender sensitivity and clean energy are both of them are very major issues. So how do you tackle them all together?
Yes, you said gender sensitivity and clean energy.
Meaning clean energy, like reducing the gender gap and the clean energy. So both of them are very big issues. So how do you tackle both of them all together when we talk about in this trade ecosystem prospect?
Okay. Okay, interesting. Thank you so much for your question. So let me take the first one first. So you said what kind of roles we can really envisage for women in these border areas. So, when I was doing this research, this is the first question I asked myself, that, okay, women are not here. But then, even as a researcher, when I go to some of these border areas, people actually discourage me that I should not be going to these border areas by myself as a woman. So I started asking myself, what are the kind of challenges I face when I go there as a woman? And if we talk about increasing women's participation, what are the kind of roles we envisage for women? And the answer I came up with was, one of the main roles where we can enhance women participation is the CHA community. The CHA community means the custom house agents. Those are private sector people that are there at these borders, but they are actively involved in all the documentation part, and they are actually representatives of both the trader as well as the customs community. So I think CHA community is a great way to enhance women's participation. You need to take specific exams to become a CHA, and these exams are conducted at different local levels, and there can be initiatives at the local level by these state governments to enhance, to encourage more and more women to take these exams and then be a part of these CHA community. And on the second question on clean energy and gender sensitivity, I agree with you. These are two big areas that we are looking at. And as I mentioned, one of the pillars of Indo-Pacific economic framework is fair energy, is like a fair and green economy. And there we are actually talking about how do you promote renewable energy. And there's research which actually shows that if there are more women in the leadership positions in clean energy sector, we can actually come up with more innovative solutions to renewable and clean energy. So I think this is a topic that's relatively underlooked at, but we need to encourage more and more women in this renewable energy sector, which will help us come up with these solutions.
Can I?
Yeah, please.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Nikita, for your excellent presentation of a very important topic. I am attending this webinar from Kerala. So I have a question. I have two questions. One is about the group activity, the role of group activism. I take the case of Kudumbashree in Kerala. We think that it is a relatively successful women-friendly program. So my query is, if we encourage such women groups won't it be, from a policy point of view, won't it be of much more effective? That is question number one. Question number two, you are engaged in the role of training and the like. So again, this is a broad question. How far Indian education in general and business, trade, and such specialized education in particular, gender friendly for enabling girls and women to take into these responsible tasks? Thank you very much again for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kurian, for your question, and I'm glad you're joining us from Kerala to attend this webinar. I think one of the states we look at as a role model for other Indian states. So to answer your question on the Indian education system, and if we are making that more gender inclusive and gender equitable, so my answer is it is not gender equitable, the current education system. But I don't want to deny all the efforts that are being put in this sector to actually make it gender equitable. And as a part of my research, over the last several years, I've met several people who are actively working on making this education system more inclusive right from the kindergarten level. I have an anecdote here, and I met a teacher who's working on revising the curriculum of the kindergarten books. And she actually mentioned of an example that how at the, even at the level where you teach these kids the alphabets, the Hindi alphabets, she says, you still have examples in books where you say, Ram कक्षा में जा रहा है, राधा खाना पका रही है. I don't know if you understand Hindi, but that you still at, even at the level of kindergarten, you would have examples that if you are talking about art, you say Ram is going to school and you say Radha is cooking in the kitchen. So these are the kind of gender biases that we need to start breaking right from the kindergarten level. Or, we still have these lines in the textbooks which says daddies don't cry or mommies work in the kitchen. So these are the kind of things we need to start addressing right from the education. I mean, and the sooner we start, the better it is, because these biases are formed very early on for these kids. So I think there's a lot of work that's happening in this area. There are a lot of organizations, especially in the edtech space, the education technology space, who are particularly focusing on this. And for your first question on women groups, actually, and how does that facilitate, I would go back to the example of SEVA, which is Self-Employed Women's Association. And I think that's one group which has done phenomenal work across the region, and even involving women from as vulnerable areas as Afghanistan, and really empowering them and making them, self-sustainable and self-independent. So I think these are the kind of examples we should look at, and because it's basically creating creating sisterhood, as we say. The whole objective of creating these organizations is to promote sisterhood, which actually helps in motivating other women and actually give them more confidence to stay in the career or take these risks to become entrepreneurs.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Anybody wants to ask another question? We're happy. We are, of course.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Rajesh Nair from Kerala.
Right.
I just joined midway, so I don't know whether this topic been covered or not. So my question is like, if we can see, I was just going around few data. I just found that the rural empowerment, the rural women, they are participating in economical details. Almost like 25% are involved in economic things like employment or work, jobs, compared to the urban. They are coming around 14 to 15%. So don't you think it should be the other way around, like the facilities which they are getting, the awareness, the opportunity which they are getting, as well as the when we compare urban and rural, don't you think the urban should be more, the number of women working in the urban should be more compared to the rural areas?
Have you understood the question, Nikita?
Mr. Singh, I'm afraid this wasn't very audible. I don't understand.
No problem. Mr. Raj, can I request you, Mr. Raj, can I request you to write it?
Yeah, am I audible?
You are audible but not clear.
You're not clear.
ठीक है, जो रूरल एरिया में जो एम्प्लॉयमेंट है, जो रूरल एरिया में जो जितने भी वुमेन काम करती हैं या एम्प्लॉयमेंट है, कंपेयर टू जो अर्बन एम्प्लॉयमेंट अगर देखा जाए तो ये बता रहे हैं कि इंडिया में 25% रूरल वुमेन जो है वो एम्प्लॉयड है कंपेयर टू द अर्बन वुमेन। तो मैं ये सोच रहा था कि कहीं ये उल्टा तो नहीं होना चाहिए, जैसे कि जो फैसिलिटीज जिस तरीके से हमें उनको अवेयरनेस मिलता है, एजुकेशन, तो ये उल्टा नहीं होना चाहिए फिगर, like more of the rural, urban women should be engaged in economic activities compared to the rural one.
So, Madam Nikita, if I've understood the question, Raji, I'll try to explain to her. If you are okay, say yes. Otherwise, of course, you can write it down. But let me try to articulate the question what I have understood. What he seems to be saying is that women in the rural areas are working more than women in the urban areas. Should it not be the other way around? My own feeling is
exactly
that
the percentage is around 25% compared to the 14% rural as far as urban is concerned. So that is the gap.
My own reading is, and Nikita, correct me if I'm right, women in the rural areas are working free of cost. So technically, they are not really counted in the female labor force participation statistics, which you and me generally refer to. Whereas we are all aware that urban and rural women are hardly sitting idle. They are working unpaid hours and for much longer hours than men. But Nikita, your expert view would be obviously better.
So I agree with you, Mr. Singh. That's one reason. But another reason is also it is true that women are, the percentage of women employed in economic activities is much more in rural. So I don't think the number is other way around. The number is correct, what's given. And this is because of women's participation in agricultural activities in the rural sector. But if we actually talk about women's participation in the urban sector, this is only documented if it is in the formal economy. Informal ones are not documented. So, Mr. Raj, to answer to your question, it's primarily because of women's participation in the agricultural sector, in the rural sector, that actually drives up those numbers.
Okay.
Not working and sitting at home is a luxury for women. And this is a luxury many in rural cannot afford. And it's only, some of the families in the urban sector. And this is a completely different topic, different from the topic for today, but it's actually that it's basically a question of affordability, that if only one member is working, can you still sustain the family? And for most of the families in rural sector, the answer is no.
Got it. Thank you.
Mr. Singh, I jump into another meeting. Maybe, I don't know if you want to take one last question and close this.
Yes, let's take one question from Mr. Sahas Bhandari. He is from Nepal. He has actually written it in the chat box, but if he wants to speak himself, or you could take it on the chat box and react if you want, whatever you prefer.
So, I'm not 100% sure by what he means, but yes, Mr. Bhandari, gender bias, and you say you're from Nepal. So I think the whole ecosystem in our South Asian countries is not very different. So the kind of challenges a woman in India would face is very similar to what a Bangladeshi or a Pakistani or a Nepalese woman would face. So I think overall, when you talk about law and punishment, law and regulation, I would look at it more from ensuring security and safety of our workplaces, of our cities, of our urban mobility ecosystem. I think that's one area where women can, where governments can play an active role. But other than that, I feel it's more the private sector that has to take a lead in reducing these organizational inflexibilities. And the role where I see government, role of the government is basically, as we discussed, converting maternity leave into parental leave. But if you're talking about law and punishment, I would associate this with enhancing safety and security of our both urban and rural mobility ecosystem. We need to make our transportation safe. We need to make our metros and buses safe. We need to have proper street lighting. So those are the kind of issues that government should be focusing on.
All right. With this, we are already about 11 minutes above the scheduled time. So I know everybody is busy and this is in the middle of the day in a way. So I must thank Madam Nikita Singla for sparing time and sharing her research as well as her working paper with us. I'm sure from the interest that you have seen, you would have noticed that everybody was enthused with your presentation and liked it. And therefore, there were so many queries and questions. So I must thank you and I must thank the participants to have made it so interesting for all of us. Let me make an announcement. By tomorrow noon, we will have this paper on our website and this presentation. You are welcome to listen to it and draw policy implications. And Nikita, I must mention, your research has lots of policy implications and very interesting implications. And I think some of these can be fixed quickly and say providing daycare centers, washroom facilities, and things like that. And if that can enhance female labor force participation, as you know, that contributes significantly to economic growth, we should do it at the earliest. So I think we must thank you and we should use this opportunity and your presentation, the working paper, to push for policy recommendations. Next week, around the same time, we have another very interesting paper, meeting trade facilitation in India to ensure continuous improvement, by Dr. Vijay Singh Chauhan. He's from the Indian Revenue Service, Customs Service, and he and another person from the Customs is going to be sharing their thoughts with us so that India continues in its journey on economic growth and development. And the focus here will be trade facilitation. So I would invite you, we will send an invite, of course, separately. I'd invite you to also join us next week around the same time on a similar issue. Before I close, I want to make one quick announcement. EGROW Foundation in its short journey and the experts in EGROW feel that in addition to financial literacy, there is need for economic literacy. What are the issues? What's inflation? What's inflation targeting? What is trade deficit? How are they important for us? And what is monetary policy and the fiscal policy and government's tax policy? And as was just mentioned in the question from Sahas Bhandari, can policy implications play a role in directing or correcting socioeconomic issues? So EGROW Foundation is running, if you go and look at the website, EGROW Foundation is running series of courses in small modules of 1 hour each lectures from on the working days on various issues of conceptual value as well as those which are in real life. Talking about Indian economic issues or talking of conceptual issues. So I would invite you to look at the website of EGROW and take advantage of these small modules which are being introduced with an objective of economic and financial literacy in our country. With that, let me conclude. Thank you once again. Enjoy a great weekend and see you next week.
Mr. Singh, thank you so much for having me. It was a great pleasure to discuss this topic, and I'll join next week because I've been working very closely with Mr. Vijay Singh Chauhan on the time release studies for last 4 years. It's a topic I've very closely worked on, so looking forward to that. And again, thanks to EGROW Foundation and to you for continuing these series on women empowerment.
Thank you.
Thank you.